Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. So my name is Celia, and I'm very happy to be here today with you to talk about user experience and psychology and what it means for video games. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever tried to pull a door that needs to be pushed? Did that ever happen to you? It's pretty annoying, right? So this happens when you have a bad user experience, when you don't really understand how the system is working and you feel that you need to grab it and pull when you actually need to push it. So that's a big problem, and this is something that we try to think of when we design anything, whether it's a system, a service, an object. We don't want to just think about it as a creator. Just thinking about the design is not enough. You want to think about how users are going to use it, how they're going to experience it, what they want to do with it, what are their goals. And so this is what we do when we think about user experience. We consider human factors when we design an object, a system, and a service. We put the human at the center of the process. So how do we do that? We need to understand a little bit how the brain works. So this is where we use cognitive science, because the experience of a system, like a game, for example, is happening in your mind. So we need to understand a little bit how the mind works to anticipate these problems. So very quickly, very briefly, I'm going to explain to you how the brain works. So this is a very simplified version of what's going on in your brain when you perceive things, when you process information, and when you learn. So when you learn something new, like right now, it's not coming from the void. It's coming from your senses. So we have way more than 5 senses, by the way. We have over 20 senses. You can sense temperature, for example. And this information coming from the senses, you're going to perceive that, and you're going to process that information. And if you learn about something new, it means that you're going to memorize it. You don't learn if you don't memorize. So what happens in your brain when you memorize? It's physically changing your brain. We have synapses. So these are the connections between neurons. And these are changing. You have new synapses that are created, or synapses that are reinforced when you learn something. So when people are a bit afraid that video games, for example, are rewiring their kids' brains, they are correct. It is rewiring your brain as you play a video game. But such as anything you do in life, reading a book is rewiring your brain, watching a movie is rewiring your brain, talking to your friends. Right now, just watching my presentation, this is rewiring your brain. There's nothing to be afraid of. This is normal. We have brain plasticity. Thanks to that, we can adapt to our ever-changing environment. So it's very important that, that our brains can adjust and change all the time. So between perception and memory, there's a lot of things happening, and there's a lot of factors that are going to influence the quality of the learning. You have biological factors, physiological factors, a lot of factors. Here, I'm mainly going to talk about attention, because we know that if we pay attention to something, we are more likely to learn it. So keep in mind that this is very overly simplified. The brain is not as straightforward. We don't have these neat little buckets that are independent, and we don't have like a street-leaf serial process, and it's not even a process. We use a lot of terms coming from computer to explain how the brain works, because it's a nice metaphor that we can understand, but the brain does not work like a computer. We don't store information, we don't process. So keep in mind that the brain is extremely complex, that this is just a way to simplify it. All right, so for each of these, perception, memory, and attention, I'm going to give you the main limitation that we have in our brain, and how to take into account this limitation, and how we overcome that in Fortnite, for example. So let's start with perception. Can you tell me, what do you perceive in this image? Can you yell it out on me? Yeah, I heard it. All right, Street Fighter. How many of you perceive Street Fighter characters in this image? I don't have a lot of gamers today. OK, so it is indeed a representation of Street Fighter characters. And when I show that, usually to game developers, I have about like 30% of people like Street Fighter is super excited, and the rest of the people are like, I don't know, maybe people, or sometimes people tell me DNA or rugs. And so this is just an illustration that perception is subjective. Depending on your own history, prior knowledge with this game, you're not going to perceive this input in the same way. Here's another example. If you look at the input at the center here, you are more likely to perceive it as a B. Now, if I add this, you are more likely to perceive it as a 13. Perception changes depending on the context. So for the same input, you're going to perceive it differently. Perception is subjective, and this is something that we have a hard time to grasp. It's a construct of the mind. So for one reality, there's a lot of different perceptions. It's changing on culture. It's changing depending on our prior knowledge, our expectation, what we care about. That's a big problem whenever you create something. In a video game, for example, it's just a series of stimuli, inputs, that players are going to have to perceive, so it's mostly visual and audio, in the way that we intended. But because perception is subjective, we can't be sure 100% that what we intended is what people are going to perceive. So this is the reason why we test our game very early on to verify if this is what's going on for their experience. So here's an example from Fortnite. Back in 2013, we were testing a lot of icons, such as this one. And we had players coming over, playing a little bit the game, and then we asked, what is this? What is that? So we can verify that they perceive the things the way we intended. So I don't know if you guessed what that icon was back then. It's representing traps in the game. The problem is that a lot of players did not remembered or recognized this as the trap icon. Sometimes they were saying this is ammunition, or maybe this is trees, or something to do with building. So we had to change it, because traps, it's a big feature in Fortnite. You need to craft traps to progress in the game. So we don't want to have any confusion with this. So we changed that icon into an archetype, a stereotypical representation of a trap, like a bear trap. There are no bear traps in Fortnite, but as soon as we changed this icon, there were no confusion anymore. So it's really important to test all that so we can offer the experience that we want to offer to people. All right, let's play a little game again. Can you all picture, like visualize in your mind, the sculpture, The Thinker from Auguste Rodin? Do you all know it? So try to picture it in your mind and try to remember what's the posture, which leg or legs are resting which arm or arms of the thinker. All right, you got it? OK, let's take a look at the answer. Did you remember it correctly? Most of us don't. Most of us think, oh, maybe he's got left on left and right on right, or cross. We don't really remember. We have, even if it's super iconic, we have a approximative memory for this sculpture. And that's because our memory is pretty fallible. Unless you're an artist who really process that information very deeply, you're more likely to remember it more accurately. Most of us don't do that. So we don't memorize things very accurately. If perception is a construct of the mind, memory is a reconstruction. So every time we try to remember things, it's not going to be accurate. It's not as if the brain was taking pictures, storing it somewhere, and if we need to bring it back to consciousness, whoop, we have the picture that's perfect. So it's not how the brain, how the memory works. And on top of that, we forget a bunch of stuff. So because of that, in a game, again, it's usually an experience that you have over several days or weeks, or hopefully a month. And so if players come back and they forget a few information, and it's critical information for the game, it's not going to be a great experience for them. So we try to give away information so they don't have to remember it. That's why we have the heads-up display. You have a bunch of information on screen, especially for a game like Fortnite. It's pretty complex. For example, every time the player is close to a searchable object, we pop out on the interface what key they need to press. They don't have to remember that information. Another example is if they care to craft an item like this one, they don't have to remember the name of the item. They just pin it in their heads-up display, so they don't have to remember which ingredients they need, how many of which, what's missing. They can just concentrate on the objectives, and we alleviate the memory load. So that's really important to take care of that. Let's do one last game. I'm going to show you some cards, and you're going to have to pick one card and to remember that card as accurately as possible. It's going to go pretty fast, so pick a card and remember it. All right, I bet I can guess which card you picked and make it disappear. Did it work? Are you impressed by my magic trick? All right, so what happened here is I've changed all the cards. Yeah, I'm not a magician, sorry. But this is what magicians do. They manipulate our attention. They're very good at understanding our limitations in perception, attention, and memory. And so they manipulate that to entertain us. In psychology, we call that change blindness. We have not good attentional skills. So when we pay attention to something, we're going to filter out the rest when we focus on one thing. So we can't really scan everything. So it's easy from one scene to the next to change a bunch of stuff, and you just don't even realize what's happening. It's pretty strong. That phenomenon is pretty strong. You can Google it. It's pretty interesting. You have a lot of games around change blindness. And so our attention is scarce. That's also a problem because we need to convey a lot of information to players. We need to teach them how the game works. And so we need to pay attention to that. Now, a lot of games challenge players on attention. It's an action game. You have to pay attention to enemies, to take cover, to do other stuff. But as players learn about the game, it's even harder on their attentional skills. So we need to make sure we pace it out correctly so they're not overwhelmed with too much information. So for example, in the Fortnite and the player versus environment mode, the Save the World, you start the game, there's immediately something to do. It's an action game, so you have to shoot at enemies, but they're behind a wall. So they're not going to hurt you right now. So you have the time to figure things out, to grasp what the game is all about, and you have time to process all the information. So it's really important to keep that in mind, to not overwhelm people. So that's what you have to keep in mind. Perception is subjective, attention is scarce, and memory is fallible. So whenever you create something, you make a product, a system, you have to keep that in mind. You have to keep that, you yourself have these problems, and all humans have this problem. So that's the reason why we use, in video games, I've been using a framework to guide us into providing the best experience possible for that game. So this is the two pillars that I'm using. The first one is usability. This is the ability of the game to be used. Basically, just for any product, you want to make sure that it's intuitive. So if you see a handle, you know you grab it and you pull it. So the same thing with games. We want to make sure that people understand what they have to do, what's the goal here. So we care about the signs and feedback that we give to players. Like, for example, if I need metal to craft something, do I know where to get it? And once I'm getting it, do I understand, how many of each I'm getting? So we take a good care into doing all these things so it's going to be usable for players. They're going to understand what to do. But a game is not a tool. A game can be usable and boring. That's a very big difference between video games and other products. You don't use a game to do something else. Playing the game is the thing you're doing. It's what we call an autotelic activity. So the interaction with the system is what we care about. So we need the game to be engaging. If a game is not engaging, it's boring, you don't play it. So engageability, it's about looking into why are we going to be motivated to play that game, and why inside the game are we going to be motivated to learn about all the things we need to learn to really master the game. So for example, in Fortnite, why do I care to learn about building? Well, in that case, we place you in a situation when you need to build your way out. So this is how we teach you how to build. So that's really important. And of course, in just 7 minutes, I don't have the time to cover all that. But this is what we look into when we do user experience. These are the elements that we look into. And we have a checklist just like pilots. They're highly trained, but they have a checklist because we know our memory is fallible. So we are not going to forget about something that can lead to a bad experience for players. And so when people look at gamification, instead of looking at everything, usually they just look at the rewards, the badges, these little things just to nudge people to do something. This is just a tiny bit of everything that you need to make a game engaging. It's pretty complicated. And so I'm just going to leave you with that thought. Whatever you're designing, whatever product you put on the market, remember that there's no such thing as a neutral design. Whatever you put in there is going to influence people, how they're going to interact with it. And so you want to take care of placing the humans first. When you do UX, it's placing the human first. So it's thinking about ethics, it's thinking about inclusion, about accessibility, so that you have a win-win situation. People have a great experience and they're happy, and you don't think about placing the business at the center, and you don't want to exploit people. So UX is really about the humans first. And that's the reason why we need to have diverse teams, because if you don't have a diverse team, what's going to end up is we all have our biases and our blind spots, and we can't find out all the blind spots by ourselves. And so this is what happens if you don't have a diverse team.
Well, we try it. And to your hand. To black. To black. Yeah. Come again. Come again, Sashi. No, too back. What I do, they get. What you have to do is how racialist thing is. Yeah. As long as that piece of white. It's not napkin and show again. That's what it is. Put your pin again. Napkin again. Right. What's it called in your hand? Man, black man ain't fight. Don't want to get fight.
This is funny because it's just a soap dispenser, but think of the impact of that sort of problems when you're making health devices. So it's really important when we do UX to think about the human for whom we are designing, and to be inclusive and diverse and accessible and ethical. Thank you very much for your attention.